Good evening. It's nice to see many of you twice in 1 week for our second lecture in the series this week. And for those of you that may not know, my name is Christy Ballier, and I'm an assistant professor of architecture and the chair of this semester's Knowlton School of Baumer Lecture Series entitled Twist. As we've discussed, a twist tactically combines and intertwines design methods, disparate fields, and physical matter. It is dynamic and implies fitness. The lecture series includes innovators that demand an expanded reach. And tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Dora Epstein Jones, a historian, theorist, and teacher of architectural culture. The lecture tonight will again twist. It will ask us to turn back on ourselves, but not by going back, but rather a look back on the discipline to expose and reveal the possibilities within and beyond its bounds. The lecture is entitled Loaded and is the sequel to Stacked. But don't worry, I think we all know the characters. According to Dora, Loaded is a short, happy talk about our bad, beautiful bricks. In this context of telling stories, which she is very good at, her work mainly focuses on the discipline of architecture and includes interrogations on the discipline's boundaries and operations through examinations of tectonics, practice, and pedagogy, as well as the generally external concerns such as gender, sex, mobility, and criticality. She's been widely published, and this past summer, she was the co-guest editor, or in her words, an intermittent weather vane signaling shifts in architectural discussions of Log 31. The issue was titled New Ancients and reminded us all that history had, well, history. And now for a little of her history. She holds a PhD in architectural history, theory, and criticism, and an MA in urban planning from UCLA. She's a past research fellow of Colucci Foundation, the UC Regents, the Getty Research Institute, and the AIA. Additionally, she has been a long collaborator with Jones Partner Architecture. And currently, she is the coordinator of general studies at SciArc, where she has taught for the last 10 years. And finally, in my role as lecture chair, or in one's role as a lecture chair, you invite people that you think can contribute to the larger discussion within the school and connect us to discussions beyond these walls. To do this, sometimes you invite people you know or think you know because you want others to know them. And in the case of Dora, I think I know her, but I really want to know more. Please help me welcome Dora Epstein Jones.
Am I loud enough? Yeah? Thank you, Ohio State University. There are some places where you feel like you have an extended family. I feel like I'm at my great aunts for Thanksgiving dinner, so this is wonderful. And thank you, Christy, for schlepping me around today and being such a good hostess. And particular thanks to Jeff. This lecture is your fault. So there. All right. On the 13th of May, 1373, the anchorite of the Church of St. Julian of Norwich, whom we commonly refer to as Juliana of Norwich, sat down to write the revelations made to her by her Lord and Savior Jesus Christ during a brief and intense illness. She initially numbered them at 37, but the abbot of the Roman Catholic Cathedral at Norwich objected, and thus these were written as 16 divine revelations. The revelations are of the following nature: a perfect tautology of divine being. See that I am God, see that I am in everything, see that I do everything, see that I have never stopped ordering my works, nor ever shall eternally. See that I lead everything on to the conclusion I ordained for it long before time began. by the same power, wisdom, and love with which I made it. How can anything be amiss? And in this oneness standeth the life of all mankind that shall be saved. For God is all that is good as to my sight, and God hath made all that is made, and God loveth all that he hath made. For in mankind thou shalt be saved is comprehended all, that is to say, all that is made and the maker of all. For in man is God, and God is in all. And I hope by the grace of God, he that beholdeth it thus shall be truly taught and mightily comforted if he needed comfort. And a higher understanding it is inwardly to see and to know that our soul that is made dwelleth in God's substance, of which substance God we are that we are. And I saw no difference between God and our substance, but as it were all God, and yet mine understanding took that our substance is in God, that is to say, that God is God, and our substance is a creature in God. Although little is known of this woman's life, there is some dispute over her role in the church, whether or not she was a recluse in her anchoress's chamber, or the anchorite protectorate of the cathedral close at Norwich. She resided in a small room in the smaller church of St. Julian, but this residence may have been due to the fact that the Norman cathedral had burned earlier in the 14th century. At the time of her writing, the masons were at work in completing the crossing tower of the main transept over what remained of the Norman stone vaults. The crossing tower is still tall to this day, made so even taller by the spire added after 1470, and again in the 17th century when the 15th century spire also burned. It's an alluring spot for the area's flock of peregrine falcons who roost often upon ledges built onto this crossing tower, and it's at this URL where you can watch the falcons roost live. Now, it's not live. This is like a really busy day on the falcon roost. I don't know what that dead falcon is there in the foreground, but that's the falcon roost, and you can go visit it at any time. Well, right now it's dark, but anyway, you get the idea. The current keeper of the writings of Juliana of Norwich is Miss Julia Bolton Holloway, a hermit of the Holy Family and keeper to the English Cemetery Library in Florence, Italy. If one appeals to the friends of Julian, known also as the God Friends, they will release the portfolios of texts carefully edited in 1947 by Sister Anna Marie Reynolds. In the Julian Summit, pictured here from 1998 in Kilcullen, Ireland, one could possibly read in the extant texts contributions from the diary of Juliana from 1378, which might say that I should be so blessed to wake upon this day. The Lord has guided me unto this day that he has seen fit to mark upon this earth his holy church, the sacred ground that upon I stand at this moment. This tower, his tower, shall rise upon this spot. On this earth it will surely reflect his glory. I do not see how it could be as tall one day. Man cannot build it so. And in the close, the mason's presence discourages my silent vigil, and in inquiring after their hours, I am puzzled to see the stones. These are cut, irregular, except for two flat sides. It cannot be right. To reach our Lord's heaven, they must be laid atop the other. I do not like this stone work. The abbot assures me daily that his church shall one day serve God's greatest glory, but I cannot see how they make it so. So watching a video of a robot picking and stacking from Vermontium and Fuller from like 2007 to 2010, I realized that this kind of stacking might be over, and therefore not a fair contemporary example. But my interest in this is not so much the use of the robot as a precision instrument, but rather the fascination we have for watching it pause and pick and pause and reach and pause and rotate and pause and lay the brick. And our fascination with the robot is like one that we might have with a baby, a kind of perverse and primeval delight derived from stacking, akin to the Fort Dodge delight described by Freud, although not very directly linked to the infant's need to protect its ego from the disappearance of the mother. Stacking is a fundamental architectural impulse. What may or may not be fundamental, however, is the stack's coherency. The classic argument, or should I actually say the modern argument for stacking, emanates out of Arnheim, the empathy argument for stacking. The primary nature, in this logic, of the stack is derived from the body to remain upright. Now I'm going to get in trouble. But empathetically speaking, stacking doesn't quite stack up. Unless we consider the stability of the base, which is more than archetypal or primordial, it's actually downright anachronistic and primitive, like thinking that our feet carry our load. The stack is, more broadly speaking, anything but coherent. Coherency is the stack's fiction. It is the stack's burden. It is special to the stack. It is the stack's magic. The stack produces pleasure. A look ma, no hands. The cantilever produces a similar pleasure, but the stack's pleasure isn't really an effect. It's hardly even a special effect. It's not a sensation, nor is it quite legible in the sense of public awe. Stacking can be virtuosic, as in stacking cows, but it's usually way too dumb for that. Instead, it is a basic feeling of a very subtle awe, perhaps more awesome to the stacker than the one who sees the stack. Instead, we operate under a beguiling myth of stacked coherency. This is the long-standing problem of stereotomy and stereometry. That is, the attempt to cut the stone such that the geometry of any one stone is to the whole more than it is to itself. It's an attempt to reconcile the material of the piece or the part with the forced unity of the whole, while at the same time respecting the craft of the part. In reading the writings of Luca Pacioli, whom we associate with the golden section, he refers often to the stone and the arch more so than he does to the drawing. As a geometer, it would seem that Pacioli was less troubled by the drawing than he was by the material geometry of the stone. We can account for his Christmas ornament style of drawings for the 1509 text of Divine Proportions, perhaps because of the materiality of this view, or more readily to the fact that the entirety of the book is dedicated to Ludovico Sforza, but the dedication itself details the stone frieze on the Urbino Ducal Palace of Federico del Montefeltro. Pacioli praises the cutting of these 72 stones to commemorate the machines used for building. And Pacioli notes that the frieze, in occupying the base of the palazzo, is a suitable analogy for the Duke's ascension to power. This is the ultimate expression of Renaissance technological prowess and an affirmation of humanist principles, and it finds a particular psychological satisfaction in that these are stones cut to describe the cutting of stones. Then, if we look at Pacioli's tree from the Divine Proportions, we can see that his concept of the proportion counts for all kinds of instabilities and complexities inherent in the world. And I think it's hard to read. Simplex, complex. We see that in complexities and instabilities on this side. Stabilities. That side. Proportion seeks to tame or control under its ordering principle. Again, this is not the same as actually controlling irregularity, but corralling and owning irregularity. The part to whole in this case is emphatically not a module, nor is it a whole solid object entirely in its own right. I am unfazed by object-oriented ontology and its claim that objects constitute their own world based on their own object relations. I'm unfazed because Masons knew this all along. The stack should have a limited geometric repertoire, if you consider it that way, but it actually doesn't. This is one of the few myths, especially perpetuated by modernism, that didn't fall into critique. The pro forma for the stacked stone or brick resists regularity. Modernist regularity was an exception, even if the members are of the same uniform size and shape. We see all kinds of shifts in direction, the offset, the lap is one of many, as well as shifts in material composition. I love how the stones up at the top of the arch in the Colosseum turn into this big, crazy mess. So what we see here in this section of Trajan's Column by Piranesi is an attempt through drawing out at control, an attempt at seeing the seam of the mortar joint as a geometrically regulating line in the drawing. The outline becomes the seam is the description of the solid. But in fact, in recounting the history of stone cutting, we read a typical account that medieval masons had no idea what they were doing. Even John Harvey of the Master Builders can't account for the ways in which the medieval masons were able to cut the stone, other than through trial and error, or through an increasingly minute and meticulous work of cutting, fitting. It's not until we get to the work of Philibert Delorme that we start to see the use of projective geometry within the text to describe the cuts. And one can imagine that with the complex surfaces of Baroque architecture, such as that of Anet Castle in Brittany, the continuous curvature of the surface can only be assured by the precise specifications for each stone. And I should mention that this applies to stone facing, but even the masonry of the wall begins to be thought of not as a single shaped chunk like we think of a brick today, but rather as a faced solid, with one face that corresponds geometrically to the attaching stone, one face that carries the imprint of the decorative or developed surface, two faces that are planar to the corresponding stones on the vertical sides, and two faces that are planar to the corresponding stones on the horizontal sides, none of which are required to be perpendicular to each other. As you can see, this becomes more of a problem ultimately then for mathematics and the contemplation of geometric solids, stereometry, than it does for stone cutting, stereotomy. The modernization of stone is contemporary with the rise of the fired brick module, made regular and repeated, not located in some original hoary condition, but struck from the very first as a ready participant in a stack. But even by 1875, the use of stone and brick for masonry is described in this textbook as a problem. How each stone connects to the next stone laterally, how the stones participate in a surface, how the surface can be a developed surface, a warped surface, so forth. But unlike a problem of masonry, these are actually not issues of solids and material, but literally geometry problems. The only illustration or mention of a solid brick in this one is in these very first pages. All else is the use of projective geometry to set into shapes and forms. To state this somewhat more philosophically, I would turn to the other 14th century text popular in England around the time of Juliana's writings, an anonymous text called The Cloud of Unknowing. Like Juliana's revelations, these are claims based in the mystic tradition of releasing the body to a sublime feeling, a surrender, in order to gain holy insight. So, for trying to comprehend a mystical beingness, yes. Unknowable, hey, no problem. That's what faith is. But for knowledge itself, for certainty, or certainty about our material world, our measurable things, nicely outlined rectangular figures, this is more difficult. Let's put it this way. We can all recall at least one bit of Kahn's discussion with the brick. And it all sounds well and fine when you put it in context of the modernist respect for materials and the Sullivan-Wright tradition of speaking about materials as if materials had a truthful nature. But allow me to revisit that quote. If you think of a brick, for instance, and you consult the orders, you consider the nature of the brick. That is the natural thing. You say to the brick, "What do you want, brick?" And brick says to you, "I like an arch." And you say to the brick, "Look, I want one too, but arches are expensive, and I can use a concrete lintel over an opening." And then you say, "What do you think of that, brick?" Brick says, "I like an arch." And so what Kahn is actually saying is that bricks are jerks. Bricks are still jerks. Even the most advanced bricks. We can make a brick out of mushrooms and corn, grow it in a lab, place it, let it stew in a kind of human waste crock pot, and this is all just so incredibly innovative. But put that amazing contemporary brick together with other bricks to carry its own load, and now the brick is called upon to do something even more profoundly architectural than just being, and well, you get a drawing like this from Arup's office. And it's not just bricks, really. There's various degrees of stacking visibility. The modernist stack of the floor plates hasn't resisted its own criticality. The visibility of the floor plate made by the free facade returned the stack to a basic partie of building. And that has been answered in the postmodern stack building, or what I call the kitsch of parts, as an approach to make a commentary on the supposed purity of the floor plate stack. But it's images like this that show that there's actually a lot of geometric handiwork that has to happen, and in the purest examples, rationale to account for the little jogs, rationale of the lines to account for the pieces in between. We can attempt to tame the stack with the regulating line, which in turn must bisect the volume unevenly to do so. It's very naughty. Ultimately, I'm interested in the inherent differenceness, down to the level of the brick or stone. I needn't turn to the grossness of the floor plate to find this. The brick is itself supposed to be a logical unit. It can be mass-produced and sent to the mason en masse. Interestingly, the stack is also supposed to be a logical unit. It's hierarchical, although that might pose some issues when you think of a hierarchy because the bottom piece is more important, but that's another story. And it corresponds both to the logic of the plane on the lateral surface, meaning it composes the plane, and yes, sometimes it's a textural plane, and the needs of weight transfer and gravity in the longitudinal or vertical direction. But two logical units do not equal a single logic. Instead, there are countless bond types that compose the relationships between bricks or stones differently. Some have a series of stretchers that make a header member articulated at the corner or require a bat to finish the edge on the straight vertical line. The running bond is the most basic of stacks in terms of the geometry of the stretchers laid horizontally, but even so, it has this half geometry at the corners and again the lap of each course. It's also one of the weakest of the bond types. If there were a single logic, it would probably be the vertical stack bond, the middle bottom. And you think like a child here, as this holds plenty of delight in terms of the purity of one flat surface wholly in contact with the flat surface above and below it. The problem with this stack, however, is in the mortar joint, which must contend with the lateral forces of each successive stack now to each other. This kind of stack is notoriously bad and leads to vertical cracking, despite the fact that it's at least visually clean. The inherent differenceness of the stack has such a long history, too. It's ancient and, according to the Renaissance fathers, foundational. The essential difference as well between non-architecture and architecture. The difference between the sticks and the master mason, Le Corbusier's family claim, Louis Kahn's only lasting relationship. Kahn's not down there. This one's not going advance this one.
Don't notice that stuff.
Don't touch it.
All right? Jesus. Grandpa, you ever work for somebody named Trillo? You own the lumber yard?
My father was a master stonemason. He never cut fucking wood.
My friend and colleague, a guy known to all of you, Todd Gannon, asserts that the history of architecture is the history of piles of rocks that lose weight over time. Yes, Todd, but that doesn't mean that the most emaciated rocks are not also jerks. This project by Greg Lynn is what I would call a game changer, or at the very least, a supreme game illuminator. It tells the age-old story, but it does so in a way that demands a reconsideration of the basis for what we might call fundamental architectural knowledge. Taken in this way as it was done with panelite, the blob is understood as a kind of brick, a potentially flexible basic unit that can allow for a wall to be both modular and to take on different stable shapes like an arch or a dome. It's also therefore considered to be the most architectural of Greg Lynn's projects, and I have read accounts of the project that assert that this is Greg Lynn's attempt to be, quote, more architectural. And one can safely assume that being, quote, more architectural means stacking bricks. But these are some bricks. If my good friend Todd is right, then it makes sense that we would not only move from thick masonry walls to masonry non-load bearing and shear walls to an even lighter version. The only lighter version would be to void the brick or stone of its solidity, which Greg accomplishes with this hollow plastic roto-molded brick, of which there are 24 basic shapes of this 3-load piece. Here they are stacking in the Sire gallery, and they look like our medieval masons. But in order to stack, typically each brick is buttered and then laid on top of each other. In masonry, the mortar joint is calculated. For an English bond, for example, that alternates courses between headers and stretchers or soldiers and sailors, the width of the mortar joint on the perp end is also calculated in terms of its width or its length to make sure that the wall ends evenly. So 2 headers plus the perp ends equals 1 stretcher. In this operation, there is no mortar joint. Instead, each brick is further voided by a Boolean operation using this 5-axis router. And then it's stacked through proximities and punctures. So the weight transference is not pyramidal, therefore. The weight transference is not going down as it would go in a traditional brick stack, although it is still hierarchical. This is what I would call an extreme case of stacking, but it shows very clearly how unexploited the spaces are that exist between the bricks, and then considering that the mortar joint was always a liquid material, it would seem to me that there's a lot of room to explore much further than we can imagine. I'm going to end on some columns because this is the initial place of my interest in stacking and the fascination I have for the column because the column just seems so very entrenched in the linguistic tradition of architecture. I wanted to look at the column differently. I didn't want to ask the column what it means. Instead, I asked what it does. And one of the many tasks it accomplishes, besides carrying the entablature, is that it tries very hard to mask its stack. An arris refers to any seam between members. The actual arris of the column and the fluted Doric order are here on the horizontal, but the arris of art history is here on the flutes of the vertical, the fake arrises. In Andrew Atwood's open exploration of columns from a few years ago, the arris is the point of an exploitable and productive geometry. It is algorithmically extrapolated, not so far off of the Des Arcs, in a horizontal section and then constructed as lozenges in foam using the robot router to carve these intricacies. Once stacked, the arris rises vertically along the column shaft, but expresses tectonically a folding across the surface. The last slide, the Instagram slide, is an image that popped up on Andrew Atwood's Instagram feed. And I immediately contacted him and I was like, wow, this is it. And he responded, what? And I said, this is it. This is the fundamental problem of the stock. And he said, Dora, I was cleaning out my apartment. I had a bunch of these foam parts, so I stacked them up randomly and took a picture of it. Thank you.